ceasefire in Gaza is holding for now. But while the confrontation between Israel and the Palestinian group Hamas was taking place, there were growing reports of anti-Semitic attacks and slurs in several American cities. William Brangham focuses on the disturbing questions this raises once again about intolerance and hate in America.
Judy, the Anti-Defamation League tracked reports of online comments, verbal confrontations, and physical assaults in the U.S. during that 11 days of bombing in Gaza and in Israel, finding, quote, a drastic surge in anti-Semitic language and attacks. That included an attack on a 29-year-old man in New York who was punched, kicked, and pepper sprayed in Times Square. In Los Angeles, 5 people suffered minor injuries after they were attacked by people waving Palestinian flags. In Tucson, Arizona, a synagogue was vandalized. The ADL also reported thousands of tweets or retweets that seemed to echo the phrase, "Hitler was right." Last week, 5 Jewish organizations, including the ADL, wrote a letter to President Biden about their concerns over this rise in these hateful attacks, asking him to speak out more forcefully against them. For more on all of this, we turn to Jonathan Greenblatt, the CEO of the Anti-Defamation League. Jonathan, great to see you back on the NewsHour. In the past, your organization has documented that when there is violence between Israelis and Palestinians, that anti-Semitic attacks in the U.S. go up. Compared now to then, are we seeing more now?
Yes, it's certainly true that in the past, conflagrations in the Middle East between Israel and the Palestinians or its neighbors have created or catalyzed an uptick of anti-Semitism in America. But what we're seeing now is more drastic and, frankly, more dangerous. The ADL tracked between the 2 weeks of the conflict and the 2 weeks before a 63% increase. And that surge is far greater than what we've seen in prior incidents, like 2014, for example. But what I'd also note is not just the quantitative, but the qualitative. The span of these attacks, they spread like wildfire across the country. You mentioned a few: California, Arizona, Wisconsin, Illinois, Michigan, New York, New Jersey, South Carolina, Florida. Acts of harassment and vandalism and violence. So number one, the span is much greater than what we've seen. But secondly, the tone, the brazenness, the audacity of these assaults in broad daylight. You know, we've seen people basically say, you know, if you're wearing a Jewish star, you must be a Zionist and you should be killed. We've seen people hurling bottles and objects at homes with mezuzot on the doors that were identifiably Jewish. We've seen people driving their cars or marauding through Jewish neighborhoods and yelling, "We're going to rape your women," right? Or yelling things like Allahu Akbar, and literally then wreaking physical violence on people. And one of the incidents that was captured was in broad daylight in Times Square, a group of people beating and bloodying a Jewish man whose only crime was he was wearing a kippah, to the point where he was left unconscious in the street while people kicked him, you know, bloodied him with like crutches. It was really quite disgusting. And to think that this is happening in America is really unconscionable.
So what do you attribute this to? I remember back during the Trump administration, you were quick to point out instances where you thought political language that fomented anti-Semitism. Do you see political leaders now who are exacerbating this?
Well, let's be clear. None of the people committing these crimes were wearing MAGA hats, right? The reality is I do believe that political language can have real world consequences, but this is very different kind of political language. So yes, we called out the prior president and his kind of acolytes, the extremists, from marching in Charlottesville to marauding through Capitol Hill. But in this case, we have people waving Palestinian flags and then beating Jewish people. And in this case, you know, what I might really draw a parallel to is the hate crimes committed against Asian Americans, where unhinged, you know, fictionalized conspiracies about China, first spouted by political leaders, led to real world consequences as Asian Americans were attacked on the streets. Well, today we have unhinged, fictionalized conspiracies about Israel, that somehow the Jewish state is systematically slaughtering children or committing genocide. And then that leads to real-world attacks on Jewish people in the streets of America, on our campuses, in our communities. So although, again, the political tenor may be different, the real outcome is the same. And that's why we think people, regardless of where you are on the spectrum, need to speak out clearly and firmly and forcefully and say in an unambiguous way that anti-Semitism is unacceptable because, again, this isn't activism. It's hate, and it should be called out as such.
In that letter that you sent to the White House, you specifically asked President Joe Biden to speak out more forcefully. Have you heard from the White House since you sent them that letter?
We have been in touch with the White House. Look, and Joe Biden has been good on these issues his entire career. From his time in the Senate to vice president to now as president, he announced his run for office, decrying the anti-Semitism that he saw, in full view at Charlottesville. So just this morning, he tweeted out a firm statement we were pleased about. But we do think it's critical for the administration to stand squarely in solidarity with the Jewish community in this moment when so many of us are feeling frightened. I've heard from Jewish people across the country, and they are feeling scared. They have extremists on the right. They have these, if you might say, radical voices from the left. And they are wondering, is it safe for me to go out, wearing a kippah? Is it safe for me to walk to synagogue on a Saturday morning? Again, this is in America in 2021. So we think leaders, not just President Biden, but members of Congress need to speak out and clearly and consistently call it anti-Semitism without making equivalence or excuses for any other form of prejudice. You can have fierce debates about Middle East policy, but that is not an excuse to assault and victimize Jewish people in America, in Europe, anywhere.
All right, Jonathan Greenblatt, CEO of the Anti-Defamation League, thank you very much for being here.
Thanks for having me.